Hello and welcome to the video. This is a slightly longer video for those of you that get in touch regularly asking how to learn to fly something like a plane when you've been flying multi-rotors, or maybe flying something like a multi-rotor when you're used to flying a fixed wing or a wing. Now, each of these kind of flying things has a slightly different set of requirements and pressures on you as a pilot. Obviously, things like this is actually the Armaton frame I built in my kind of quad build over Christmas 2024. This is actually a 7-inch model, but the controls that you use for this, throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, if I can even say them, the way they are used to fly a multi-rotor is fundamentally different than how you use it to fly a plane or a fixed wing. And that can be incredibly confusing. Now, the examples I'm going to go through here, I'm going to talk about the differences between, so that if you're familiar with flying a plane and you want to fly a multi-rotor, hopefully it'll kind of illustrate some of the key differences, give you a fighting chance. Hopefully it'll kind of give you some tips and tricks. The thing with a plane and a multi-rotor is I personally find them very different to fly as a pilot, a radio control pilot. I find multi-rotors are an awful lot of fun. They can be set up to kind of cruise around and look at the countryside. But however, the flying experience of something like a plane or a wing is very different from that. I find these incredibly serene and much closer to that experience that you have when you have one of those fantastic dreams where you're able to fly, particularly if you're flying FPV and you're looking out the camera at the front of this thing. This is the closest that you're going to get to that. However, everyone has their own particular likes and dislikes. There's no right or wrong answers with this. If you like fixed wing, you like multi-rotor, both of them are fantastic ways to fly. But this video is aimed for those of you who are flying one of them but fancy the other. So before we get into the differences between flying a multi-rotor and flying a fixed wing aircraft, it's worthwhile just taking a moment to talk about some very basic differences between the two. Now, this may feel like teaching my grandmother to suck eggs. However, I think it's important to set the same kind of space before we kind of get into the differences. Because if you haven't flown a multi-rotor, or if you haven't flown a fixed wing, or if you haven't flown both, some of this stuff might not be as obvious as you think. Now, let's start with a multi-rotor. Now, lift is created from the rotors only. By the rotors rotating, they basically push air downwards, and that holds the model into the air. So if the model weighs 600 grams, each of the motors is creating 150 grams of thrust. So those 4 motors together create a thrust of 600 grams and keep it in the air. If it needs to go up in the air, then you increase the speed of the motors, increase the thrust. If you want to fall, you decrease the speed of the motors, you decrease the thrust. Now, this means that unfortunately, if you turn the motors off, it falls out of the sky like a brick. It is useful for kind of losing altitude incredibly quickly. If you want to drop under particular obstacles, maybe you're flying towards a tree, there's an option to maybe blip the throttle, increase in height to fly over the top, or drop the throttle and to drop in the air and then catch it and fly under the branches. Both are options. The other thing is, of course, is that this is an omnidirectional model. It can fly in all directions easily, not just the direction that it's pointing. So most of the time you're going to be flying forwards, but you can absolutely hover and move to the side, backwards, just like a helicopter. There is an awful lot more of constant tweaking of all the controls for a multi-rotor. Unless you're using some of the features like angle or horizon mode, where a lot of the help is being given to you in terms of self-level support, there is a little bit of interplay. So, for example, if you tilt the model forwards, so you're going to start flying forwards, some of that thrust that was keeping it in the air is now directed slightly backwards. So you need to increase the throttle slightly to maintain the height. Not the kind of thing you have to worry about for DJI multi-rotors, but definitely for things like Betaflight and iNav, especially if you're not using one of the modes or sensors like LiDAR or barometer to try and maintain height and you have that stuff turned on. Also, the coordination of all the controls is needed too. We'll talk about those controls in a minute. As mentioned in the introduction, that's kind of the whole point of this. But you will find yourself tweaking all the controls together. You won't just be able to set a control at a particular level, kind of set your throttle for 50% and then fly around and never touch that throttle. All of them are working together in concert. unless you ask the flight controller to do an awful lot more of that work for you. And when you're learning to fly, that can be a great aid. Last thing to mention is that it is very sensitive to all the controls. A little bit of movement on the throttle can dramatically increase the speed if you're banked over, or increase the height if you're kind of hovering, or a bit of both. So you need to be very fine with your controls. If you are coming into multi-rotors and you've had a bit of experience with Xbox or PlayStation, then you know what? That's absolutely going to work great. It's going to give you that kind of muscle memory. You have to have that very fine muscle control to fly them smoothly. Fixed wing is a little bit different. The lift and the thing that keeps it in the air is actually the airflow flowing over the wings. So all the motor is doing in this particular instance, generic flying, is pushing the model through the air. The air flying over the wings is what creates the lift. It does mean then is that a wing can glide and stall. So you can absolutely turn the engine off, put the throttle to 0 in a fixed wing model, and depending on how floaty it is, depending on how long it will glide. The other thing that you'll come across is something called stalling. So long as the airflow is enough over the wings and the wings are at the right attitude for it to generate the lift that you need, then you're going to be fine. As the plane slows down, then it eventually gets to the point where that airflow is disrupted, detaches from the top of the wing, and the wing no longer generates the lift. That is called a stall. And that's why some planes, when you're landing them, you have to bring them in at reasonable speed. Some planes are designed to be quite floaty and capable of being flown very slow, and that makes it an awful lot easier for them to land. Don't forget that a fixed wing will only fly forwards, unless of course it's super windy. And what I mean by that is that if you are flying at 50 miles an hour in the forward direction, but the wind speed into the nose of the plane is also 50 miles an hour, it will appear as if it's sat in still air. And this is the difference between ground speed and air speed. Ground speed is the speed that is covering the ground. Air speed is the speed of the air flowing around the aircraft. And they can be very, very different. If you're planning in flying lots of windy conditions, I'd recommend learning to fly on much calmer days to give you a little bit more latitude when you actually get into windy conditions. Fixed wings are a lot more forgiving when it comes to things like throttle and rudder controls. I know quite a few buddies of mine who, when they're having a relaxy day, will set the throttle just for one particular value, maybe 45-50%, a nice cruise throttle when they're at the altitude they want to fly at, take their hands off the rudder and the throttle in a mode 2 radio, and just use the right hand stick, the elevator and aileron, to fly around and not touch the other controls at all. So it can be a much more relaxing Zen experience to fly a fixed wing if you want it to be. And lastly, don't forget for FPV, it's always flying more or less in the direction that you're looking, unless it's being pushed around by the wind. So with all that said, let's look at the individual controls and how they differ from one or the other. And again, this is kind of aimed at both of you that are either coming from the multi-rotor side looking at fixed wing or vice versa. The throttle on a multi-rotor, as I've already mentioned, increases the speed of the motors. That increases the amount of thrust, and depending on the attitude of the model, it will either go straight up in the air or to one side. It's very handy with the throttle, and one of the habits that you can get into with a multi-rotor is that you blip the throttle when you are flying along relatively low and you realize that you're coming up on something like a fence. You blip the throttle to give you a little bit more height, also potentially a little bit more speed, but it's the height that you want, and you shoot over the top of that particular obstacle, and then you can drop the throttle back down and you will kind of start to sink a little bit more back to the original height. Throttle is also how you land and take off. Blipping the throttle or raising it relatively aggressively when you're in a multi-rotor will get it into the air, and then lowering the throttle is going to make the model drop to the ground. There will be a very, very fine point on the radio, and you can use radio and Betaflight 9Av settings to make this point easier to find and easier to kind of sit in, where the model will kind of hover in the air. You can also use modes as well. But again, the throttle is a fundamental control for a multi-rotor and incredibly sensitive. For a fixed wing, all the throttle is doing is just changing the speed of the plane in a forward direction only. And it's only affecting the speed. It's not affecting the altitude or the attitude. Well, not unless something horrific is set up with something like called the motor thrust angle, but we'll talk about that again. It's less needed when you are diving around. So when the plane, you push the nose of the plane down, it starts to lose altitude, it's going to speed up. So you can back off the throttle if you want to maintain the same speed in the air. And also, more importantly, it's needed more throttle when you are climbing. So if you're just poodling around at one particular altitude and you decide you want to climb, then as you pull the nose up, most pilots will introduce a little bit more throttle just to maintain the speed and make sure that you never get into a stall condition. And of course, with a fixed wing, you can put the throttle off and it'll just glide around. And again, with a fixed wing, cool thing is that it's not really a fundamental piece of equipment. You'll notice that even full-size aircraft, unless they're doing hard acrobatics, will just set the throttles for the amount of thrust that they want and kind of leave it there and kind of touch it 3 or 4 times a minute. Whereas with a multi-rotor, you'll be touching it 3 or 4 times every single second when you're flying with flippy floppy. Next one to talk about then is rudder. Rudder is another one of those primary controls for a multi-rotor and controls how it spins around its axis horizontally. And the rudder is an essential part of multi-rotor flying. If you're coming from the fixed wing side, you will be surprised how much the yaw comes into play, because the yaw is how you are going to decide which direction the multi-rotor is going to face. Not necessarily flying, but face. And it's used all the time to point in the direction that you're flying around. And again, this is one of those coordination things, going back to what we talked about a couple of minutes ago, where the rudder, the aileron, and the elevator are all working together in concert so that you are flying in the direction that you are looking. Because it's very easy to be looking in a direction that you're not actually flying in. Fixed wing, rudder is, I would consider, almost a secondary control. And as I've already said in the previous slide, you can kind of forget about rudder completely. As long as it's trimmed neutrally on the plane, then you know what? You can just ignore it. Pilots that have been flying for a while will use the rudder along with the aileron to perform what's called coordinated turns. They look a bit nicer because the rudder is kind of bringing the tail around, as well as the elevator and the aileron that we'll talk about in a moment, kind of actually performing the turn. It just feels and looks an awful lot nicer. And once you see somebody do a coordinated turn versus an uncoordinated turn, you'll kind of go, ah, yeah, that does look better. However, I do have friends that never ever use it. Literally never ever use it. Well, apart from when they are taxiing on the ground with some kind of tail dragger and there is that rear tail on the rudder, and it's how they kind of line up before they open the throttle to start their run and take off. But when they're in the air, they never ever use the rudder to actually perform any maneuvering. Next control then is going to be the aileron. Now the aileron controls the side-to-side movement in something like a multi-rotor. And obviously as the multi-rotor tips over from one side to the other, it's going to start flying in that direction. Again, some thrust is being used to push the model away from the orientation it's currently in. However, in a multi-rotor, the aileron isn't used for turning. The aileron is used to drop one side, to fly sideways, or to correct a slip from one side or the other. So again, it's one of the controls that's used with everything else. In a fixed wing, it's one of the primary controls, I would say. Still controls the roll from side to side, but it's used in conjunction with the elevator, because typically what will happen is you will start the plane rolling over and then you will pull back on the elevator, and that will cause the plane to perform a nice gentle turn. You can also use it, of course, for acrobatic rolls like you can with a quadcopter, and be careful because when it is rolled over and you're using the aileron, you drop a wing, you'll probably notice that most planes will also drop their nose slightly, so you do need a little bit of pressure on the elevator just to keep the nose level, so as you're performing the turn you don't drop any altitude. Last control then is the elevator. The elevator is going to control pitch or movement backwards and forwards. And this in a multi-rotor is how you actually travel forwards. You typically would push the elevator so the nose drops and increase the throttle a little bit so that it doesn't drop in the air, and that's going to start you moving forward. And similarly, when you want to slow down, you can then pitch the multi-rotor back. The thrust is now slowing the model down, and usually when you're doing that, you're also going to drop the throttle just so that you don't immediately start to pop up into the air. In terms of a fixed wing, well, elevator again is what I would call a primary control. It is there to control whether you are climbing or diving in the model, and it's also used with the aileron for turns 2. Now, it only really affects speed, the elevator, whereas it affects the speed of the model over the ground fundamentally as part of a multi-rotor flying. It only affects the speed as a function of gravity. And what I mean by that is that as the model dives, as I've talked about before, it will increase speed, and as you climb, there'll be less speed. So again, typically the way it works is that as you start to dive, you can drop the throttle back a little bit, so there's less thrust at the back of the model, so it doesn't speed up too much. But more importantly, when you pull the elevator back and it starts to climb, you would normally introduce a little bit more throttle so it isn't going to stall. And it is, as I said, needed as part of the aileron stuff to do the turns 2. So that's the 4 main controls, and they're kind of big differences between them. So hopefully one of those will have made sense to you, and the other one will have kind of been interesting if you don't fly that particular model type. So what are the top tips then for multi-rotor versus fixed wing when you're learning to fly? Well, with a multi-rotor, let's start there again on the left-hand side. You will need to get used to managing the throttle for height and using the throttle all the time, micro moving it just to make sure that the model is not sinking or rising, it's the right speed, and the actual speed of the model itself is more dictated by not only throttle, but the attitude of the multi-rotor as it's flying around as well. Don't forget, for a multi-rotor, rudder is a primary control, and that means that it's one that is used all the time, whereas you can pretty much fly without it in something like a fixed-wing model, and actually things like flying wings don't have rudders at all. But a multi-rotor, it's something that you have to learn to fly. It's one of the primary ways that you move the model around, particularly to make sure that you're flying in the direction that you're looking. Much more synchronization of the controls needed in a multi-rotor. I would say there's a little bit more skill needed unless you are using one of the modes like angle or horizon, where there's a little bit more help. But once you have mastered that coordination, they are incredible fun to fly. If I was learning now, I would still do it the way that I learned to fly rotor aircraft. I actually learnt with helicopters rather than with multi-rotors. And I would start small, try and just hover in one spot at specific height. When I was learning, there was something called RAD School of Rotary Flight, originally developed for helicopters, but actually still not a terrible way to learn to fly a multi-rotor with small steps. The worst thing you can do with any model is try too much too quickly, because that always ends in disaster, a crash, and sometimes a model that you never see again. Be aware that it does take months of practice to fly well. Looking at YouTube videos, you would think that it only took 15 minutes. Everyone has their own speed of learning and their speed of kind of picking this stuff up. Some people, it can take a matter of weeks of concentrated effort to become really proficient at flying a multi-rotor. Some others, it can take a very long time. It is at a race. When I was learning, the only thing I tried to do was do it better than the day before. And when I had one of the lessons down and I could do it without having to tax my brain too much, that was the point I moved on to the next stage. I would recommend you use a simulator to help with coordination. If you're a fixed-wing pilot, there are lots of free simulators around. Most modern radios will plug into a computer and act as a joystick and allow you to use the same controls on a simulator and fly these things around. Crashes and mistakes in a simulator cost nothing to repair. And the last one is, I would expect to crash a lot. You are going to get things wrong, you are going to get confused, you are going to have what is known in our circle as a brain fart, and things are suddenly going to not make sense. Your thumb or your fingers are going to do the wrong thing on the radio, and it's going to end up smashing into the ground, or a tree, or a hedge, or a fence, or something else. That is absolutely part of learning. The nice thing with multi-rotors is they tend to be pretty resilient, and the worst you can do in most cases is usually things like damage a prop that you just replace and you're ready to go again. In terms of fixed wing learning, there's a little bit more to think about in terms of the setup. With fixed wings, centre of gravity and the amount of movement of the control surfaces for the aileron, elevator and rudder are crucially important to set up. So make sure that all those things are done. Again, I'll put links down below to some of the additional videos on how you set that stuff up so that it all makes sense for you if you're not been flying fixed wing for a long time. Again, things like the throttle and the rudder are almost secondary controls for things like fixed wings. When you learn to fly, you can kind of set it to 50% throttle, leave the rudder in a neutral position, and just fly it with the aileron elevator. And that's why I like a Mode 2 radio personally, because that right stick acts like the control yoke in a full-size aircraft, where when you push it forwards, the nose goes down, when you pull it back, the nose goes up, etc. Hand launching is the way that I tend to go with this stuff. I wouldn't recommend fitting landing gear when you're first starting. All it's going to do is be one more thing you have to try and find when you ultimately crash. Trying to get models that are easy to hand launch, easy to fly, and easy to repair is what it's all about. There is a level of trimming needed for manual planes and wings, and that is because by default the controls need to be slightly offset to counteract things like the torque roll from the motor. Maybe the central gravity isn't in exactly the right place. There are lots of things that you need to think about. Most flight control software will do all the trimming for you, but if you are not using something like iNav or ArduPlane, then there's almost going to be some trimming needed. That's not something we ever get involved in multi-rotor land, because a multi-rotor is always using flight control software. But if you're using iNav or ArduPilot, you won't need to do any trimming. The other thing as well is do pick the right plane to learn to fly with. Don't try to scale Spitfire as your first model that you want to go and learn to fly on. You are going to smash the living heck out of your first 3 or 4 models. That is unfortunately just the price you have to pay to learn the skills. Cheaper planes that are designed for beginners, things like the Bixler, things like the Skywalkers, those kind of things are fantastic to learn to fly on, because not only are they a little bit cheaper, they're also very easy to fly and pretty easy to repair too. What's your speed when you're flying? With a multi-rotor, it doesn't really matter. The height of the model will let you know when you are being distracted from where your throttle is. However, with a plane, if you go too slow, then potentially your wings are going to stall and then it's going to fall out the sky. Landings also with a fixed wing need a little bit more planning too. For example, when you are in a multi-rotor, you can land in, a couple of meters square regularly without much time and effort and much practice. With a plane, you're going to need a lot more room. So ideally, you're going to want something that's got a couple of 100 feet of runway in inverted commas to come and land, but also you need to have a decent approach that you're going to do that too. Normally, the way that you would land a fixed wing is you're going to fly into the wind, and that means that over the ground it's flying slower. Remember that whole thing about the difference between airspeed and ground speed. So you need to usually, before you have thrown the plane, think about where you're going to land it and which way you're going to come in to land. Again, use a simulator, and again, expect to crash a lot. So hopefully that's been interesting and helpful for those of you that may be flying planes or wings and interested in flying a Betaflight or iNav quad. Again, this is not really the same with something like a DJI model. DJI put a lot of time and effort into making their models incredibly easy to fly and not requiring any time, patience or practice to do it well. However, there is an awful lot of satisfaction to be gained to being able to fly any of these things well, smoothly, and to get them back in one piece every single time. It doesn't always happen, but it's always nice when it does. So if you have any questions, pop them down below, but hopefully that's been a little bit more instructive for those of you that are looking to make the move from wings to props, or props back to wings. Thank you for watching my video. Check out the playlist, and adding Painless 360 to your search terms will help you find my content. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. You can support the time I spend here answering questions and helping others by using the links in the video description.